Today, I'd like to talk about the Seiko BellMatic that I recently picked up. Now, it's not for the reasons you may think, namely the alarm function. But before I get into that, I'll just give a brief history of it relative to the other major mechanical alarm watches. Now, I have a few other videos on it that are more thorough, but just in case you're here and you want to know, basically, mechanical wristwatch alarms were sort of a, dare I say, fad, probably from the 1950s to maybe the late 70s. And these really were the three main companies that made them. The other company I don't have, so technically I've omitted, is Vulcain with their Cricket, and the Adolf Schild, sort of, I guess, mid-range, low-range mechanical alarm movements. Aside from those two, these are the main ones. Historically, JLC came out first with their Memovox in the 50s, I believe, and it went from manual to automatic. And this is an example of an automatic. Seiko came out with their BellMatic automatic mechanical alarm in 66. This is a 67. And finally, Omega released their Memomatic in around 69-70. Now, by their very nature, mechanical watch alarms are very complicated because you're sticking more stuff in that also needs energy to be powered via spring barrel. So in almost every case, you have watches that have a second spring barrel. One to keep the timekeeping going, and the second to keep the mechanical alarm, which is basically a little hammer hitting a post. And so in this case, you wind this to wind timekeeping barrel, and this for the alarm. This, though, is a bit weird in that you manually wind the crown to wind the spring barrel for the alarm, but you can only shake the watch to power the spring barrel for timekeeping, which is really weird. So you have to do this to make it work, but you have to wind the crown to power up the mechanical alarm. This one forgoes that entirely in that it has one spring barrel that powers both. The price you pay for that is it's a weaker sound. Let's see if we can turn that one up. You could hear it reasonably well now, but in a normal, louder environment, it really would get drowned out. Let's see if we can get the Memovox. This is obnoxiously loud. And in my experience, wearing it publicly gets some weird looks. People are not used to mechanical alarms. So with that out of the way, let's talk more about the BellMatic. Now, again, these came out initially in about 66. They were manufactured for about 10 years until maybe the late 70s. For as far as collectors, they're more interested in the different shapes that you saw in the 70s, like integrated bracelets, sort of UFO round cases, all sorts of more oddball things. Whereas this early one, which is a 4006, that's the movement designation, and case 7010 is the case designation, is a much more traditional case, and that's what caught my eye. Now, if you look at this angle, you may or may not recognize what appealed about this watch. This Lug Design is the spitting image of the Marine Master, except they beefed up the Marine Master one substantially by sticking that sideline where the drilled lug hole is. But other than that, it's the same design, and that really blew my mind. Now, keep in mind, the Marine Master 300 is a reissue of Seiko's dive watches from the 60s. This is a product of the 2000s in various forms, and the Marine Master 600 spring drive version is an even more beefed up version of this. And you get used to wearing it, but you know, it's a substantial watch, and I had always wondered what would happen if you had a watch case similar to this in a smaller size, and that's what this is. Now, obviously, you have different crown positions. This is a one-piece case, whereas this is just a standard screwback, but when you're wearing it on your wrist, you get the same effect of the lugs, and I just found that just amazing, and it really made me pursue it. And you can see here's a size comparison. It's obviously smaller. I want to say off the top of my head, probably about 38 or so millimeters. It's, I guess you could call a mid-sized watch by late 60s standards. But it's the case design that's so interesting. And to take it further, the original iconic Seiko dive watch that had this lug design was the 6215, which I'll post here. That came out in 1967. This watch is from April 1967. The 6215 was a limited production. They had sort of some teething issues, and its replacement in 1968 was the more well-known 6159. Same lug design. But really, what's interesting about this is, based on the date of this case, you had the 6215. Then, at roughly the same time period, this case came out in the BellMatic, and after that, in 1968, the 6159 version of the their dive watch came out using the same lug design. So this actually came before the 6159, going by dates. Now, amongst BellMatic collectors, this particular case design I think isn't terribly desirable. There's another version of this watch with a business bell dial on it that is desirable. And it was actually made in roughly the same time period, in the mid-67s, and that would be more desirable, but I didn't care because, again, it was the case that appealed to me, and this is in really good condition. And I've been wearing it for the last few days, and it just brings me great joy because, in just simplest point is, I get to enjoy sort of the case of this in a much more compact form. And I'll say the dial is pretty nice. Handset's pretty nice because it's so small relative to that. Having a 3 o'clock crown doesn't dig into your wrist or anything. What a particularly interesting point about this is a day date, and even though this was bought in Japan, and technically I think there were certain JDM versions, apparently none of them ever had Japanese days. They were all, I think, only English, which I guess meant from the get-go that they wanted to export this watch to the world. And that also takes me to the jewels. This is 27 jewels. This is the earliest. Eventually it went to 21 jewels and then 17 jewels. That was in part because the US had tariffs on jewels. I don't know, perhaps other countries too, but at least the US did. And that's what motivated them to bring it down to 17. Another little factoid is, I believe in the 60s, roughly, at least amongst Japanese watch manufacturers, there was sort of a jewel war where the different companies tried to stick as many useless jewels onto the movements, even the rotors, of watches to see who can come up with the highest jewel count. I don't quite know if that was a issue in this one because, again, the mechanical movement is pretty complicated, but that may have played a factor in it. And that's really the gist of it here. That's really why I wanted to make this video. There are a bunch of other sources for BellMatics, and I don't claim to be a specialist or anything, but the case lug design on this is just absolutely amazing if you happen to appreciate the 6159, 6215 Marine Master case design, and it gives you an opportunity to wear a smaller version for pretty cheap. These are about a few $100s, and they're really, really great to wear. You do want to make sure that yours is working because people don't particularly like servicing mechanical alarms, especially BellMatics, because they're complicated. Parts are an issue, like with all older watches. So it is something to keep in mind. But let's see if we can... There we go. And I guess I'll finish with this last part. As I demonstrated, this Memomatic is really quiet, and the idea is it's supposed to sit on your wrist like in a business meeting, so only you can tell, even though in my experience it doesn't really work that way. It's just too weak, and I guess that's the price you pay for having one spring barrel to power both things. And as you've heard, this is obnoxiously loud, and it's a bit embarrassing in relatively confined places like trains or planes, or at least it used to be when you could take those things. But eventually, hopefully, things can sort of go back to normal. And again, in my experience, it's a bit off-putting for people when they hear that really, really, really loud hammer. Super powerful. And I find this to be a perfect balance. It's not too loud, but it's not too quiet. And how fitting is it that relative terms to collectors, who prefer Swiss brands, Seiko isn't going to carry the same value, the same weight as Omega or JLC. So in part, that's, I think, why these BellMatics are so undervalued relative terms. But the reality is, this is, if you're going to torture yourself and be a masochist and demand to use a mechanical alarm, this is a much better alternative than the other two in my experience, because it's just loud enough for you to hear. And it's really a nice watch, but again, my main issue is the lug design, and this is just another little bit of Seiko history that's not really been documented before, so I thought I'd put it out there if anyone else is interested. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.